So far in this class session, we've taken a look at dependency and empowerment, and now for the next few minutes we're going to dive into a couple of key topics of sustainability and evaluation. So let's just dive right in. Sustainability is defined by a highly scholarly source, Wikipedia, is the capacity to endure. For humans, sustainability is the long-term maintenance of responsibility which has environmental, economic, and social dimensions, and encompasses the concept of stewardship, the responsible management of resource use. So what jumps out quickly with this definition is it's the capacity to endure. You're looking at long term, and there's some sort of responsibility that comes with it. Now, as we think about sustainability, we need to also consider that the communities and neighborhoods in which we work are already somewhat sustainable, because if they were not, they would not exist. And so there's already some sort of survival strategy and some form already taking place there. And most communities are sustainable somewhere along the line because God's at work there. God's fingerprints are all over it, knitting and holding things together. And so when we look at sustainability, Bryant Myers helps us out by putting them into some categories, and he looks at four different categories for sustainability. The first is physical sustainability. So this includes the basic things that one needs to live and survive physically by: food, water, health, money, ability to create and manage wealth, etc. And then there's also the mental sustainability is what he looks at, and keeping in mind that perhaps the deepest form of poverty is being. And so the mental capacity here talks about the marred identity, and having people that will listen to you, and having people be able to believe in themselves, and having the capacity to learn, and so on and so forth. So Myers also discusses the topic of social sustainability, or sustainable systems, economic systems, political systems around somebody that will allow them to be sustainable and to develop a sense that they are bigger and part of something that is bigger than themselves. And the final one is spiritual sustainability, or a dependence on God, or a personal faith. Also lumped into this category comes things like fighting against injustice and taking social action and helping those that don't have a voice. What's interesting about the concepts of dependency and empowerment and sustainability is that while we strive not to create a dependency on ourselves, what we really want to create is a dependency on the Lord. In that regard, that's the only way true sustainability is going to be reached. So it's a little ironic in there in that we do everything we can not to create dependency, but ultimately we want to create that dependency on Jesus. So in order to see if things are sustainable, in order to see if things are moving forward and are heading in the right direction, evaluation is a huge concept and a big part of what we do. We constantly need to be evaluating and thinking about, are we reaching our goals? If we're not setting goals, that could be a problem. And then evaluating, are we reaching the goals? Are we heading in the right direction? Are we going where we want to go? So let's take a few moments here and just look at quickly at evaluation. And as we do that, let's ask ourselves some questions. The first, who do we evaluate for? Now, often the funding sources or donors or grants or organizations that sponsor us are the ones that drive evaluation. And so then our evaluations are geared towards them. But is this really the way it should be? Now, should we not evaluate more for the community members, more for those in the community, so that they can see what they want to see and see if the desired results are happening that they would desire, not necessarily the ones supplying the resources and the funds? It's easy to fall in the trap of evaluating solely for the funding entity or solely for those giving, as opposed to those involved in the actual programs and projects itself. So, and why do we evaluate? Well, evaluation kind of provides us with a roadmap. It's hard to get somewhere if we don't know where we're going. And so evaluating helps us not only set the destination, but then to see if we're making steps along the way to get there. And then what do we evaluate? Well, we can evaluate long-term impact. We can evaluate relationships and how they're changing and transforming, keeping in mind the relational understanding of poverty to see if people's relationships really are being restored. We can evaluate values and worldview and systems and structures. And if it's a health program, concentrating on immunizations, we can evaluate hard numbers. Are we reaching our goals of seeing people immunized? If it's a literacy program, are people learning to read? And so we can evaluate some of those more measurable things. And then, who do we evaluate? We should evaluate both those in the programs as well as those facilitating the program. So every aspect should be evaluated along the way. And then the final question is, will it last? That gets us back to the sustainability question. And so we should evaluate and look at not just the physical sustainability, which we often look at in evaluation. Evaluate, are we spending the money in the right places, and are we going to be able to make the next budget year meet, and all those sorts of things. But we should not just evaluate the physical, but also the mental, the social, and the spiritual sustainability as well. And so there's two main forms of data that we can collect while we're evaluating, and they both can serve us with the purpose. So those are quantitative and qualitative. Now, quantitative is more numbers and things like that, and qualitative is more anecdotal, so stories and testimonies and so on and so forth. Now, both of these methods are helpful and needed. The qualitative data often tells the story behind the numbers. So it's all well and good to talk about, well, how many children learned how to read in the literacy program. But sometimes telling the story of little Sally behind the numbers helps us then to see why that is important, that children are learning how to read. Now, one of the things that if you're working for a spiritual or a faith-based NGO that's trying to see life transformation and trying to see people come to a more holistic understanding of themselves and ultimately faith in Jesus, that's kind of a hard thing to measure quantitatively. So life transformation, achieving a better future, they're hard to put numbers on because it's really easy to tell stories. Well, Lihia came to Jesus, and we can tell the story of her family and how her family's been changed. And so one of the ways that we can do that is asking people, well, in the programs that you run, how many are people being transformed? Yes, no, maybe, and we kind of get some data along those lines by asking them to rank or to categorize folks. But it's hard to get quantitative data on life transformation. And so as we continue to speak about transformation, and if our ultimate goal is relationships being restored and working for people, we really want to see not only individual lives but communities transformed. And so Myers presents a very useful tool in his framework for transformation. And so the first thing to consider is, like we talked about, we need to know where we are going. And so what better future are we after? Now, who defines that better future? Hopefully it comes from conversations and it comes out of the same community. But ultimately, Myers would argue that the better future we're after is for people to know their true identity and vocation and to have just relationships that work for them. In other words, we're trying to get towards and see the kingdom of God come on earth as it is in heaven. Now, it's important to remember that we have all these different relationships at work and at play with people, and so we're not just trying to restore a relationship with myself or with my community, but with the systems around me, with the environment, with the broader economic structure in which I live, because we really want restored relationships that work for the person. And so keeping that in mind, that that's the future that we're after, these just relationships that are working for people, let's jump back into this framework for transformation. And so let's think about the process of change. Now, as we're working towards transformation, and working towards sustainable communities, there are a few principles to keep in mind with that. One is that the process needs to belong to the people. It's all about relationships, and the principles of truth, justice, and righteousness should prevail. And if we're not quite sure what to do or what direction to take, we should make the choice that does no harm in the communities in which we work, and have a bias toward peace as opposed to violence and the conflict along the way. Now, there's conflict, interpersonal conflicts that need to be resolved, but resolving those shows and demonstrates a bias towards peace and shalom and wanting to live in that. And so some of those principles are at play. Now, to see those things come about and see transformation come about in a community, there are various agents of change that are at work. So the first agent of change is God. God's at work. God's at work in the community, and He's doing amazing things. And a lot of times it's coming alongside and seeing what He's doing and joining Him in that. And often God works through local believers. So what are the local believers doing? Some would argue that at times the local believers can be big obstacles because of the reputation that they might have in the community or different things, but God works through the local church, and so it's important to see what's going on in the local church and important to come alongside that and to partner with them if at all possible. Another agent of change is the holistic practitioner, you. You're making things happen. You're either going to be a positive change agent or a negative change agent. So your job is to work extremely hard with some of those principles that we already talked about, to be a positive agent of change in the community. And then we can't forget that there is a negative change agent at work in this world, in Satan, in the evil one, who's out to rob, kill, steal, and destroy. And so it's easy when we're working with impoverished communities to focus on the things that we can see, especially coming from a Western mindset and a Western worldview, to focus on the physical. But we cannot forget that we are really involved in a very spiritual battle. And oftentimes our brothers and sisters in the communities in which we're working, especially in the developing world, will have a much keener sense of that. And we can really learn a lot from them as we combat the spiritual realities and principalities in the communities in which we work. And then finally, to keep in mind that we're after sustainability, and we're after holistic sustainability in the physical, the spiritual, the mental, and the social. So that's a very quick and brief look at some of the topics of sustainability and evaluation. But this framework helps us kind of think about those things. So it helps us know, what are we evaluating for? Well, we're evaluating to see if people are reaching and discovering their true identity and their vocation. Are the relationships beginning to work for them as opposed to against them? And so these are some of the principles and the agents of change that we can look at as we try to determine and try to see if things are really sustainable, and if they're not, what changes and adjustments we need to make.